Lessons from Queertopia by Farhang Rouhani, from the book Queering Anarchism by C.B. Deric, J. Rogue, Deric Shannon, and Abbey Volcano. This text from theanarchistlibrary.org. Paths to Queer Anarchism. I discovered anarchism later in life than most people. By this, I don't mean to suggest that there is a maximum age requirement for entry to become an anarchist, or that there is any kind of linear way through which we develop our ways of thinking and acting. But I would like to begin this essay by saying a little bit about how I got here. In my undergraduate and graduate educations in literature, political geography, and cultural studies, I came across few, if any, opportunities to study anarchist thought closely. Nor was I involved in any kinds of movements or communities organized around anarchist ethics. My thinking about the world, as it developed in graduate school in particular, was shaped largely by Foucault, Gramsci, and Lefebvre, and their descendants, specifically focused around Marxist political economy, queer theory, and the everyday practices of state formation and globalization. My doctoral thesis centered on how middle-class young residents of Tehran, Iran, experience themselves as citizens and consumers in relation to theocracy, democracy, and neoliberalism within their practices of using satellite television and the internet. It is very curious to me now that I was influenced by so many theorists that were themselves influenced by anarchist ways of thinking without the word anarchism ever really being uttered. This reveals a lot, I think, about our education and wider social systems in the United States and their ignorance and anxieties about approaching anarchism. There is so much work clearly derived from and aligned with anarchist approaches that does not call itself that. In any case, my first introduction to anarchism came in the Commonwealth of Virginia, of all places, when shortly after I started my teaching job at Mary Washington College, now called the University of Mary Washington, in 2001, I was approached by a group of radical students to be the advisor of a newly formed student group, the Anarchist Social Theory Club, ASTC. I, of course, said yes, knowing very little, but also being very interested. Over the next few years, we collaborated on yearly reading groups and seminars, ranging in topic from anarchist social philosophical history to anarcho-feminism and the intersections of queer theory and anarchism, to a much more practice-oriented project called Rights to the City, which focused on a squatting experiment in downtown Fredericksburg, Virginia. From the beginning, I approached anarchism with a good deal of skepticism, especially in the ways that anarchist scholars until recently unproblematically talked about human nature in essential terms. But at the same time, I felt more and more drawn in to more recent anarchist critiques of domination, coercion, and identity politics, and the emphasis on ethics-based, rather than rights-based, practical models of creating new worlds in the shell of the old. One of the projects organized by ASTC was a yearly workshop series on different radical activist and community projects in the region, ranging from Richmond indie media to helping individual prostitutes survive, HIPS. In 2004, two members of the Richmond Queer Space Project, RQSP, came to Mary Washington for a workshop, and I immediately connected their theoretical and practical engagement with creating a queer space around a set of anarchist ethics. RQSP was a micro-scale activist and community-building project based in Richmond, Virginia, which lasted from 2001 to 2006, and which had a very dynamic presence in the city. While active in organizing rallies and workshops and holding weekly consensus-driven meetings, RQSP was made particularly vibrant by its creation of a material space, Queer Paradise, which at different times operated as political, social, and living spaces for different members of the group. It was largely through the combination of my involvement with ASTC and my exposure to RQSP that I, in my mid-30s, came to identify myself as an anarchist. I wanted to start my essay with this personal story, partly to provide full disclosure of how I became interested in anarchism, and how my interest in anarchism was initially of an academic nature, but also to emphasize the widely different paths and trajectories that bring people to particular ideas, movements, and practices. What I would like to argue in this essay is that while queer and anarchist theories offer inspiring, creative, utopic alternatives, they often do not get into the complex, contradictory, messy processes through which ideals are enacted. We tend, for example, to valorize consensus-driven practices without paying critical attention to the critical gap between our idealized consensus models and the complex ways in which they are practiced. My goal is to describe the rise and demise of RQSP as a way of taking these complexities seriously and as a way toward understanding how such movements can be better sustained. I will begin by examining 3 analyses of queer anarchism in practice, and then observe the complex processes through which RQSP created a queer material space, with an emphasis on the sometimes contradictory politics of affinity and identity that emerged. What I present here is the product of a year-long research project interviewing 10 members of RQSP, and is a shorter, hopefully more accessible version of a forthcoming article in the free online academic journal Acme, an international e-journal for critical geographies. Affinity, prefiguration, and queer anarchisms. Within the academic world, anarchist perspectives have recently inspired and been inspired by a variety of radical theoretical frameworks, including queer theory, feminism, critical race theory, and radical environmentalism. 2 important recently developed aspects that have a direct bearing on the formation of queer anarchist politics and projects such as RQSP are affinity and prefigurative politics. Scholars conceptualize affinity as a group of people coming together, sharing a common ground, and developing spaces of support and communication. Affinity politics, then, involves perceiving the hopes and fears of seemingly culturally and regionally different people as interlinked, forming coalitions that can negotiate a temporary common ground, and moving beyond divisive identity politics. Prefigurative politics demands that activists adhere as much as possible to the world they would like to see and how they live and act in the world today. As such, it presupposes equality and imagines a collective subject of resistance, rather than arguing for individual rights that can be added into the existing status quo. The processes of politics are as important as the result, involving the employment of non-hierarchical, participatory, and consensus-based models of action. The result is a dynamic vision of utopia as an ongoing process, rather than as a goal that can be achieved through granting individual rights. Affinity and prefigurative politics as such share a radical confluence with queer politics in their critique of identity politics, concern for ethics and relationships, and advocacy of practicing utopia through experimentation. For a deeper look into these elements, I will now discuss the works of 3 scholars on queer anarchist practices. Jamie Heckert conceives of anarchism as an ethics of relationships. He critiques the extent to which sexual orientation is a state form, one of the many everyday processes of state formation through which people's opportunities and actions are rigidified and controlled. Ultimately, people's desires and identities cannot be contained in state-sanctioned state forms, and those people produce alternative realities in relation to their partners that sometimes evade control of the state. Heckert's take on resistance to sexual orientation continues a central tradition of anarchism, but expands it to a realm, sexuality, not extensively dealt with by anarchists. In addition to serving as critique of the state, he presents ways in which people are actively engaged in a prefigurative project in their everyday life. In a similar vein, Gavin Brown synthesizes anarchist perspectives on affinity, autonomy, and play with a geographic perspective on queer space in his research on queeruption gatherings. The temporary spaces of the gatherings provide opportunities for the creation of a queertopia through the ways in which they construct a non-hierarchical, ethically aware, sexually positive community and space. Furthermore, the gatherings provide opportunities to challenge the social divisions that result from identity politics through providing temporary spaces for the creation of autonomous, affinity-based relationships centered on ethics and in mutual respect. Lastly, Eleanor Wilkinson examines the role in politics and emotions in the work and daily lives of queer activists. She argues that emotions are often undervalued in how we think about activism, and that a queering of thought on activism involves, among other things, challenging the notion that only certain kinds of emotions are appropriate in certain kinds of spaces. For example, she suggests that the seeming openness and consensuality of autonomous activist organizing often depends on silencing certain kinds of emotions, such as anger and frustration, and bracketing sexuality as a private or a secondary matter. Instead, she argues for a reflexive openness to discussions of emotions that potentially lead to greater emotional sustainability for individuals and groups. These research pieces converge around their desire to expand the field of anarchism to revalue sexuality, emotions, and relationships to people, groups, and movements, and to present a full range of spaces of activism beyond our fixation on street politics, to include the range of everyday spaces and practices through which people engage with constructing new worlds. Wilkinson, in particular, goes far in considering the complexities and contradictions of such a project. While anarchist perspectives on affinity and prefigurative politics are inspiring in their explorations of opportunities for solidarity and creating new possible worlds, they often do not present the complications and complicities that can be involved in building a new world in the shell of the old. For a closer look, I now turn to some observations on the Richmond Queer Space Project. RQSP and the messy politics of space making. The Richmond Queer Space Project was founded in 2001 by 4 self-described Richmond queers who had previously established chapters of the Lesbian Avengers and the Queer Liberation Front, and were seeking to create a material and symbolic space that would support queer political actions and community formations. The original space that the group occupied as Queer Paradise was a cheaply rented, dilapidated loft in downtown Richmond. The group members I interviewed reflected proudly on their accomplishments with creating this first space. As a large warehouse, it held endless possibilities in how space could be allocated, and from the beginning, they could make conscious collective decisions on how a queer space should look. For example, one of the members of the collective used a wheelchair, and the group made a conscious effort to build a space for her that would suit her needs, such as a low door, and that would make others conscious of disability issues. The experience was empowering on both an abstract level and on a practical level of gaining building and construction experience. Also, the space served simultaneously as a living space for some members and as a meeting space for RQSP and other activist Richmond groups, adding to its general character of having endless possibilities. The use of this space ended in April 2002, when police and city inspectors condemned the building and gave the residents 2 hours to leave. The group floundered after that, meeting periodically in people's houses, in university campus buildings, and on a farm. Queer Paradise reemerged in November 2002 as a leased office space in a location just a few blocks away from the first space. From the beginning, there were conflicts and concerns about the extent to which this space had the effect of de-radicalizing the group. Some members considered this new kind of space to be very conventional and unqueer, but it was ultimately consensually agreed to largely because it would be a more publicly visible space that might be more accessible and safe for new potential members. There were other ways in which a de-radicalization of the project was happening in this moment. For example, in the change of RQSP from an underground to a nonprofit organization. While group members actively tried to maintain the nature of the organization, any official state-sanctioned organization must adhere to certain rules, including having a hierarchical power structure. This de-radicalization is also evident in changes in the mission and goals of the collective. The first mission statement identified the goals of the RQSP as 1. To provide a space to promote community among queer-identified people and encourage queer activity in Richmond. 2. To provide free meeting space for queer-positive groups who work to challenge heterosexism, sexism, ableism, racism, and classism. And 3. To educate on queer and related issues through pamphlets, speakers, conferences, queer cultural activities, and a lending library. The new, more generalized mission statement associated with the second space was, quote, "The Richmond Queer Space Project maintains a queer-friendly space and resource center, promotes queer culture in Richmond, and links queer experience to the wide spectrum of social justice work." End quote. This reflects a significant change, from the more radical tone of the first statement to the more generic, inclusive, social justice tone of the second. These changes were not uniformly accepted within the group, and came to a dramatic head in the context of one event in particular. This happened in June 2004, in the context of a rally in opposition to House Bill 751, the so-called Marriage Affirmation Act. The state's largest mainstream LGBT rights organization, Equality Virginia, had organized a rally and was set to have its members and allies speak on behalf of gay marriage rights. And the members of RQSP spent a considerable amount of time and energy debating whether and how to be involved. 10 members were set to deliver a strong anti-marriage statement, but other members of the collective did not want to antagonize the mainstream LGBT movement in the presence of the larger threat of the bill. They rewrote the speech in a way that could establish a temporary ground of affinity with the LGBT marriage movement, while at the same time including the collective's own beliefs of marriage as a normalizing institution. The speech that was ultimately given clearly identifies RQSP as queer, makes linkages between queers and other marginalized groups, and argues for solidarity based around the fact of the bill being as much about further controlling the lives of individuals as about marriage specifically. It concludes as follows, quote, "As HB 751 came straight into our lives, it created activists. And in that respect, there is an opportunity on our horizon. Let us figure out how to struggle, not just for our own group rights, but against our common enemy. And let us not grow comfortable when it is not our group that is under attack." End quote. Participation in this event provided opportunities for building connections by establishing temporary ground while broadcasting a critique of marriage and state control, but it also led to the most severe conflict, ultimately leading to the demise of the group. Some members ended up feeling betrayed by the conciliatory tone of the speech, criticizing it as a form of assimilation politics, and ended up forming a separatist queer posse within RQSP. The members who had supported rewriting of the speech were also left with ill feelings about the queer separatists, expressing that their actions were divisive, lacked an ethics of care, and were overly dismissive of the concerns of the LGBT activists. Basically, what ensued was a divisive form of identity politics, of who was queerer than whom, within a project that was consciously attempting to be opposed to identity-based political divisiveness. The split also represented a breakdown in processes of consensus building. The processes of consensus building around participation in this event were time and energy draining, and ultimately unsuccessful. I think this brings up an important question of whether consensus-modeled groups should always have agreement as their goal. Perhaps the irreparable fracture that developed during this moment could have been avoided if members could have agreed to a temporary ideological separation, with the idea that RQSP did not need to have a singular ideological vision. There are other significant sources of conflict that were voiced in my interviews with members of the collective. Age appears a divisive issue. One of my interviewees, an older male member of the collective at 30-something, argued that the younger members tend to be more narrowly focused on using RQSP as a platform for carrying out queer activist projects, that the older members are more focused on creating a space and a community, and that those in between often felt stretched in both directions. I think that age is an important, unrepresented source of conflict in anarchist politics, and particularly so in the United States, where the scale of the movement is so small and discontinuous through time that there aren't the same kinds of cross-generational ties that there can be in other radical activist cultures. Race and racism also were important issues, as RQSP consisted primarily of white radicals, and Queer Paradise was situated within a Richmond neighborhood that was the product of long-term segregation. The neighborhood consisted mostly of a combination of long-term poor African American and affluent gentrifying white and African American residents. The tensions from these changes made RQSP members feel at times like white colonists, and at other times totally excluded from the narrative of urban decline and renewal in the neighborhood. Lastly, there were important issues having to do with scale and the limits of radical activism in a small, relatively conservative southern city like Richmond. During its existence, RQSP had as few as 10 and as many as about 30 members. For those in the collective who were seeking to make the space more accessible, it was shocking that the group didn't grow beyond that. A trans-identified member of the collective told me that he had recently wanted to start a chapter of gay shame in Richmond, but given the small size of the mainstream visible gay community in Richmond, it seemed wrong to start an organization that would serve to critique it. Such a statement, I think, has important implications on the nature and extent of radical queer politics possible in certain kinds of places. What we get when we admit our limitations. I do not mean to diminish the significance and vitality of autonomous queer collectives like the Richmond Queer Space Project. The members I interviewed informed me of all the ways in which their association empowered them, sexually, politically, and culturally, and ended up impacting their professional futures as well. My concern has much more to do with how to cultivate longer-term impact and sustainability. I realize that much of the vitality of projects such as RQSP is related to their temporariness and the looseness of affinity associations. But among other things, it concerns me that very little queer activism has taken up the role of RQSP in Richmond since its demise 4 years ago. I would like to end by suggesting that we need to develop a much more extensive knowledge base and practical toolkit for being able to deal with problems when they appear. For one thing, it is tremendously important to appreciate the challenges of trying to build a new world in the shell of the old, the need for all the forms of emotional support and reflexivity that activists and academics alike tend to ignore, and the specific kinds of opportunities and constraints provided by different kinds of spatial contexts. More specifically, in the context of queer anarchist politics, we need to pay more attention to ways in which identity politics is bound to impact us as a part of the sexual world that we currently inhabit, so that we can engage and deal with its divisiveness when it appears. And we need to approach the notion of Queertopia as an ongoing, constantly reimagined process, within which contradictions and capitulations need not be equated with the end or failure of the project. The long-term sustainability and dynamism of our movements and spaces depend on admitting our limitations and learning from the critical gap between the ideals and enactment of our projects.